joins us, anybody who joins us late or who isn't able to join us today, we can catch the recording on the Vermont Landlords Association YouTube channel. That's actually where we're posting all of these sessions. So you can go back and look at them later. But today we are very excited to have with us Brian Miller from Green Mountain Resolution. So Brian does mediation and dispute resolution type work. He's a former law enforcement officer with a ton of experience doing negotiations, and now has transitioned into sort of more private practice doing that. He is one of our mediators for the Landlord-Tenant mediation program. So if you haven't checked that out and you're having a dispute with your tenant, that's also a good resource for you. But at this point, I will turn this over to Brian Miller, not other Brian.
Hey, don't get me talking. I won't stop.
Well, good afternoon, everybody. I'm very happy to share with you anytime I can kind of spread this message of resolution and peace. I was telling the folks we were just signing on that there's so many things in our world that we have absolutely no control over, and so if we can have some control over the things that are really close to us, in our peace in our own lives, and with those things that are important to us, and in this case, the landlord-tenant relationship, or the tenant relationship, is what is near and dear to you all, whether you're a professional landlord or you're just kind of doing this on the side to as another way to die. It's really important to have peace in this relationship. So before, I'm going to share my screen in a minute, but I'll just tell you a little bit about myself. I live in Essex, and I retired after 28 years with the state police, and I did a bunch of things. The thing that's probably most relevant to to mediation is I managed our crisis hostage negotiation unit, which is all about slowing down a situation, listening to people, and you need them to do what you need them to do at the end of the day, but you want to do it as safely as possible. So that's what kind of led me to do this in my retirement. I've been doing this professionally for about 6 years, and I just feel fortunate to be able to do it and kind of share my experience as well as training that I have in this field. So I'm going to try to share my screen and put up a PowerPoint, and I will try not to have this be death by PowerPoint. Can you guys see that?
Ken, thank you.
Perfect. So this is going to be, so I'm going to go through a brief, I do training, so this is an example of training I do, which usually is about a 2-hour training. I'm going to do it hopefully in 35 or 40 minutes, and then open it up for questions, and hopefully we'll be able to do some participation, and we'll just see how that goes as we go along, where you can shout out the answers or ask questions. So I call this effective conflict management for landlords, or whoever the situation is. Even though my business is about resolutions, conflict is inevitable. It is always going to be with us, and so managing it is really what it's all about. Managing it, it's here to stay. So you may have heard this, and since we're right at lunchtime, I hope this isn't the case, but 80% of conflicts occurred because somebody was hungry. Have you heard that?
So I did not, but that doesn't surprise me if you read the book Power of Habit, because if I meet 3 less than desirable people in a row, I'm hungry.
Yep. So anything going on in our life that's a negative, whether we're hungry, whether we're overtired, whether we're drunk or intoxicated, it's certainly that's going to affect how we deal with conflict. So objectives of this training or seminar today is to recognize the importance of managing conflict in this relationship we have with business relationship between landlord and tenants. Learning your own personal conflict personality, and when we think everybody's signed on, I will upload an assessment that I will talk about in a minute, and learn how to have that difficult conversation when we need to have it. And figure out if we do need to have it or if we can let it pass. And learn skills to have the conversation in addition to when to have it. So as introduction, why do we want to talk about conflict in a landlord-tenant relationship? A couple people just want to shout out why, other than the obvious. I mean, why do we need to bother talking about this?
So this is one of these weird platforms where the audience actually can't shout at us. They could put
Perfect.
something in the Q&A as a response.
Okay. So yes, so you can certainly feel free to answer, or you can just look at this as a rhetorical question. So, um, so we need to talk about it because right now you still can't evict people, right? Without cause. Is that right?
Nope, you can.
You can. Okay.
Evictions are back open again.
They're back open, but they're difficult to do at best, and they probably always have been.
I'll jump in, Brian. For the record, as a landlord of almost 30 years, and Angela, no disrespect to the profession of being a lawyer. Rarely have I found actually going through the eviction process worth it compared to when you pour into your ability to communicate and walk them through. I've done a lot of buyouts, as you know, Angela.
Mm-hmm.
I've had a high success with half of them, again, is on the issue of not giving into my temper.
Cool. So that's great. Yeah. So that's eviction is probably your last resort because nobody's happy. You spend money and time, and getting people out is difficult, even though it can be done. So, and some people are like conflict, and some people don't like conflict. But I mean, most people would prefer not to have it. So, talking about it and trying to manage it is going to make everybody's life easier, and you're going to sleep better at night, right? Can we just all get along? Well, we wish it was that easy. Our entire lives there's people that we can get along with and we can't get along with, and this relationship and for landlords and tenants is one of, I mean, I hate to say it's adversarial, but it certainly can be that very easily because you each have interests and they don't always align, and you have a power aspect there. Not always the landlord having the power, but sometimes you have the tenant having the power, and of course the courts can go on either side. So you have a power aspect that kind of goes back and forth.
Well, and I think, Brian, not to jump in over the top of you, but sometimes
Sure.
where we see that power shift is around access and access issues, because that's a situation where the tenant is in control to some extent of the landlord's ability to get into the unit to do certain things.
Mm-hmm.
Excellent point.
Yeah, good. Work it out or move out, get out. It's not that easy. It's like work it out or find a new job. It's not easy either because it's hard to find workers and it's expensive to retrain people. So the same thing. Every time we kick somebody out or they move out without paying rent, you have a loss there. It's a bottom line loss, but it's also a emotional loss, which causes stress and causes our lives not to be good. Is sometimes we ask, is the problem me? Is it me personally as a landlord or me as a tenant that's causing this conflict? Are there things about me that I could actually change so that the life of my tenants is a little better? Maybe I'm not cut out to be a landlord. Maybe I need a management association to do this for me. Maybe I need to invest in something different. So you may think of that. I've been a landlord before, and it's not my favorite thing. So if I could avoid that, I definitely would avoid that.
This may be politically incorrect, but I recommend anybody who's thinking about buying a property, ask themselves if the tenant owes them $1,000 and they're told to go blank, blank, blank. Are you tempted to call Angela, who's a phenomenal attorney in eviction, or are you tempted to pick up a baseball bat? If the answer is the latter, do not buy rental properties. And I literally use that with people and they laugh, but it sort of drives the point home.
Mm-hmm.
Excellent. Yeah, and then sometimes we say, is there someone to blame, and who is to blame? So is it important to figure out who's to blame in conflicts? I'm going to talk about that. So do we know conflict when we see it? I mean, I think most of us do. What are some things that you you know things that happen that conflict is inevitable. In the chat, or I guess some of the panelists here can talk.
I think, Gina, could you restate the question again, Brian?
Yeah. So, do you know conflict when you see it? So, like, we know this is a hot dog. We know it when we see it. So, what's going on with our relationship with our tenant that we know there's conflict? What are the signs?
Personally, mine is everything from getting the rent on time to getting in to see the property. Also, one topic we actually haven't touched on is helping mutual tenants try to see each other's perspective of truth.
Mm-hmm.
So I would say anytime you're getting more than a mild amount of resistance, you've got conflict.
Good. Anybody else in the chat? Has anybody ventured in the chat yet?
I have not seen, we do not have any information in the chat or questions.
Well,
What do you
I
think?
would just say a sign of conflict sometimes is the language that people are using with each other, and the tone. And many times we see sort of defensive posture by one side or the other if they feel like they've been accused of something.
Yep. So yeah, so this is obvious. Rent or no, late or no rent. Obviously, there's a conflict there, especially if a person had been right on time or had a system in place, and then that suddenly stops. I would think not keeping up property would be a sign of conflict, whether or not you have conversations with somebody, but if you see that things just aren't looking the way they should or they had been. Breaking the rules, clearly if somebody's just not abiding by the rules, there's going to be conflict, especially if you need to enforce them. And what about avoiding each other? If you live in an adjoining property and all of a sudden you don't want to meet your tenant and he doesn't want to meet you out in the driveway, that's probably a good sign there's some conflict. It looks like there might be a question in the chat.
Yeah, it looks like there's just typing in Cody boys and all. Cody, great to have you on here. I hope all is going well. Just mentioning our the chat's disabled, so I realize everybody we should probably use the Q&A as opposed to the chat. My apologies, but I'm just letting everybody know.
Good. Okay, so yeah, and there's a lot of signs of conflict. I think we know this, but this kind of just gets the creative juices flowing. And for us, I think depending on what type of a personality you are, I mean, if this is what you think about when you wake up in the middle of the night and have trouble getting back to sleep, that's obviously a sign of conflict, that something's going wrong, and you kind of need to figure out how you're going to deal with it. So communication, of course, is the key to life. Communication creates conflict. I think we know that, or lack thereof. Communication.
Brian, we just started to interrupt. We just had a great contribution. When the tenant does not respond to phone calls or emails, you have a budding conflict.
Silence, yeah. Excellent. So communication reflects it just by either silence or everything we do say. And then, communication really has to be the vehicle for productive, and of course, it could be destructive conflict and management, whether that's face-to-face, written documents, or that type of communication. So really, that's what we're talking about is communication. So this is a good quote. There's no such thing as a diplomatic hand grenade, right? Mm. Because eventually, once the pin's pulled, the hand grenade is going to go off. So not having a difficult conversation or allowing conflict to grow is like pulling the pin in a hand grenade. Eventually, it's going to go off, and it's going to do some damage, most likely. And so we want to try to mitigate this and deal with it as quickly as possible, ahead of time if possible. So let's kind of look back. How do we personally, as people, human beings, how do we learn to handle conflict? So I think the most obvious is how we were raised, right? So how your family handled conflict. So when we are adults, probably at least when we get into our 20s, we pretty much are solidified. This is the way we're going to be um, in all aspects of our life. This is our personality is formed, and how we deal with conflict is pretty much already set, unless something traumatic happens to us. So think about how your family handled conflict. Was your family stuffers? Were your family screamers? And what were the benefits and the lack thereof? Can anybody think of like a saying that would reflect how your family handled conflict, either through the chat or the panelists? Think of like a phrase or a saying.
There was some old TV show, the guy said, we handle it really healthfully. We just bottled it up inside.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Like a sleeping dog, don't wake the sleeping dog. Yeah, my family was a pretty much a stuffer, and we actually, it's not bad. I mean, I think there's a verse or an adage that says, don't let the sun go down on your anger. And that's definitely a good principle. But the problem is if you just apologize to your sister before you go to bed, or your brother, and don't really mean it, in the morning it may still be there. And if it's not dealt with, it may fester. So think about that. So how your family handled it is probably how you are handling it today, and it may not be great, but it's reality.
I may add in, Brian, phenomenal book, Fierce Conversations by Dr. Suzanne Scott, which I just started for my fourth time, taking a couple classes on it. She made a brilliant point. The less able to have fierce, and she meant robust, not necessarily, Rocky Balboa and Apollo Creed. The less able we are to have fierce conversations, the smaller and smaller our world gets between that other individual. And because there then becomes so many topics that we can't talk about. So this is a little off tenets, but it's sort of the same type of thing. And she uses a phrase, C equals R. The conversation is the relationship.
That's good. Yeah, excellent. So how family handled it, then your history with violence. So if you were brought up in an environment that you were, where you actually had to fight physically, or if you were in an abusive home, physically or verbally, you're going to deal with conflict totally different from someone who, perhaps had a solid family, and people were educated. You might have had religious upbringing that caused you to deal with violence or not have violence. So depending on, I think about people who brought up in a war-torn area over the world. I mean, their history of violence is crazy. And that's the lens that they're going to see conflict through, most likely.
And that comes into play and is important sort of here in Vermont, with Vermont being a refugee resettlement area. So we get a lot of new Americans or folks coming in who have come from those situations. They're generally going into the rental market, and that can create some conflict on its own.
Yeah, definitely. And then your worldview, your worldview. Do you see everybody as evil? Do you see people as good? Just getting back to those philosophical things. The way, how you see the world is important, and that's how you're going to address people and think about the way that you want to be treated by people. That's the way you're probably going to treat people as well. And just like Angela said, the people that are renting from you may have a totally different worldview. They may have no coping skills. They may be in really difficult situations, so they're gonna handle conflict in a totally different way, and it may not be positive. So I like this. If you can't get rid of the family skeleton, you might as well make it dance. So we think of, we have everything that's made us people. There's good and there's not so good, but you might as well, you really don't have any choice. You got to use it, and you might as well particularly pick the good parts and exploit those. So what I like to do in classes is have participants take a conflict assessment. And did we say that we think the chat is working now, or?
We got everybody working in the Q&A, and I think, unfortunately, I just checked. We had a couple emails come in from people saying about the Eventbrite issue. I just texted Brandon with one, so hopefully we'll have a couple more on. But my guess is Eventbrite might have hit us today.
Okay. So what I will do is we'll somehow get you or the conflict assessment, and I hope you don't mind a little off-color humor, but essentially, there's different assessments online where we take a simple test and we take it and we figure out what your conflict style is, and you already may know you may know that you're a competitor or an avoider in the area of being a landlord, and depending on what area of life you're thinking about when you take this test, you may find that your personality is totally different. At home, you may be an avoider, but at work, you may be a tyrant. So think about your role as a landlord when you're taking this test, because it does make a difference. So generally, I have people take.
So I just took this test.
Okay.
And if anybody wants to guess what my conflict style is.
Okay.
As an attorney.
Before we do that, though, I should tell them the different, where the different options are, and then we will definitely decide what Angela is.
Circle back around and see which one I fell into.
Right. So I'm going to go through them. The first is competing or forcing. So this is our type A personality. And when you're going through this, think about, okay, I want to know what my personality is. If I have a partner that is also involved in the business and communicating with tenants, I want to know what their personality is. And then I also would be helpful to know what my tenant's personality is, because and am I dealing with one tenant or am I dealing with their partner? So if you kind of know where people are falling on this assessment, it can be really helpful. And same thing, people in your family or people that you work with, it's good to know where they stand. So a competitor, win-lose approach. So I need the rent paid. I'm not going to rest until it's paid no matter what. So it can be pretty direct. It can be very assertive. And these all of these traits can have good parts and not so good parts in what we're trying to, depending on what we're trying to accomplish. They seek to achieve goals without seeking to cooperate. So basically, these are the options, and you either abide by them or you don't. It's good for emergencies. It's good for someone that's there's a burning house. We don't have time to have a committee and figure out what we should do. You need someone to say, okay, let's get out. It's good for quick, decisive action when something happens. And it's especially good if people are aware of and support this approach. If people know that you're like this, and they're in agreement that yes, in the time of an emergency, we want someone to do this. Incidentally, there's about 20% of the population automatically know what to do in an emergency. They know what to do in an active shooter situation. They know what to do if something happens in the grocery store. So if you're one of those people, great. If you're not one of those people, seek that person out. When something really bad happens, find the person that really seems to know what they're doing and is quickly and follow them. So that's good. You can learn how to do this stuff, but it's much better when you're a natural at it. So that's competing or forcing. Then there's on the opposite spectrum, there's the avoider. So this person simply avoids the issue. They just aren't going to deal with it. I don't want to cast any stones, but I did read something recently in a newspaper article that's in this area, and it was pretty interesting to read. But avoiding is certainly something that can be done, and there are a lot of avoiders out there.
Would you say these are all tactics in themselves?
It can be a good tactic. Is that what you're saying?
Yeah, because there's times obviously you got to deal with it. One of my favorite books is The Obstacle is the Way by Ryan Holiday. But there's times where avoiding an issue to buy a little bit of time will sometimes let itself dissipate, i.e. the impact of hunger on negotiations or a night's rest of sleep. Questioning, I love Sun Tzu Art of War. So I always try to question what's the best time of day, what's the best platform. We probably all had clients that may or may not imbibe in more liquid than they should. Catching them the time of day. It was a big impact to have robust and fierce conversations.
Yeah, I always tell this story. So I drove in state police. I drove Howard Dean when he was the governor a little bit, and one day we're at the airport getting ready to fly somewhere, and he had his briefcase open. And he's throwing out. He had an old fashioned briefcase. He's throwing all these papers on the floor, and I said, what are you doing? He says, well, I find that that most issues take care of themselves after enough time, and so this is all garbage. These are things that I don't have to deal with because they're done and past. And I said, that's interesting. And then he talked about how same thing in the medical profession with many people's injuries kind of take care of themselves and they don't always need medical attention. So yeah, so being an avoider is definitely a strategy that works sometimes. So you're not asserting your own goals or helping the other person. Works when there's no chance of winning. If you're the boss or if you're not the boss and the boss tells you this is what you have to do, or if this is the day that we're going to decorate for Christmas and there's no getting out of this, we just do it, right? The issue is trivial. Sometimes it really doesn't matter, where we go to eat or whatever. So that's good for an avoider. Sometimes, like I said, and Brian said as well, sometimes issues resolve themselves. But it generally isn't a good long-term solution. The next is an accommodator. So this is somebody who cooperates to a high degree. They don't want to ruffle feathers. You can accommodate. It could be at your own expense. So you may give somebody a little more leeway than they should get, and then you kind of end up being a little bit feeling used at the end. It's effective if the other party is an expert. So if you are in a rental partnership with somebody that's really knows what they're doing, and you can just certainly accommodate, let that person take over in particular issues. It preserves the future relationships with the other party by being an accommodator. So if this is somebody that you have a long-term working relationship with, you may want to accommodate the other person from time to time. But it can be some of the negatives. The person can build resentment who accommodates too much because they can say, "Gee, I always accommodate," and now the other person takes advantage of it, and then that can cause problems. So you definitely don't want to be completely an accommodator. The other is a compromiser. So this is kind of lose-lose. Neither party achieves exactly what it wants. This happens, of course, all the time nationally. Nobody's happy. It's like, are you happy? No. Are you happy? No. Good. If nobody's happy, we've probably accomplished something. That's kind of the way I look at the federal government. So it does require a moderate level of assertiveness and cooperation by both parties. It's good when you need a temporary solution, which is what's always crazy about the national level. It seems like that's all we ever do is get a temporary solution. So a compromise is good for that, and that may be in the situations of early COVID when we could not evict people. This may have been compromise is probably what happened a lot because we needed a temporary solution and we couldn't really do what we wanted to ultimately do. Both sides have equally important goals. I think that certainly happens in the case of our field. It may be easier way out than problem solving when problem solving would be better. So a compromise doesn't always solve the problem. It does kick the can down the road at times. All right, a collaborator. I think Angela's probably a collaborator, but I'm not sure. This is where you pair up the other party to achieve your goals. This is win-win instead of win-lose, generally. It's good for complex scenarios when you're looking for new solutions. It requires a high degree of trust. And it may take some time. So collaboration does take time. It's not good for emergencies. I think when the mediations that I've done for landlord tenants has generally, so far, it's been a collaboration where everybody really is trying. So far, I've seen both parties are really trying to understand each other's goals, and they do want to come out with something that's going to benefit both of them because it will ultimately benefit them. So let's see which What do you think about Angela? Brian, what do you think?
I'm thinking I'm going to go collaborator.
Mm.
What do you think, Angela?
Well, I think that was actually one of my lowest scores, or one of my, not lowest, but the at the other end.
Mhm.
And I actually, the one that came out as the top one was the competing slash forcing, which actually doesn't surprise me as an attorney and a litigator,
Sure.
because that's what I do for work, is force an opinion or attempt to force an
True.
opinion on somebody in court. Now, there's levels to that. And, the next one down was compromising. So that makes sense if you're negotiating or trying to work through something. But that, type A personality just
Got you.
screamed through right there.
Right. Okay. Good. Well, it's good to know. Yeah, and so we all have default. So our normal self, especially when we're under stress, we're going to go to our default. We're going to go to the one that we're most comfortable with. So it's good to be aware of that, because there are times in any relationship where we need to be assertive, and we need to say, no, this is the way it is. You can't do that, or you need to say, look, this is what the lease says. Go back to that.
And
I
sometimes
don't
we
care
have
if
to
I
understand that that's our default and ratchet it down a little bit. So,
Yeah, I don't care if I'm an avoider or I want to appease this person.
right,
I really have to go with what the lease says. And I mean, you can
right.
use your personality. That's the thing. You can use your personality to accomplish. It's like, boy, I hate being the jerk here, but you know what? This lease does say this. So you really can use whatever personality that you have, and achieve your goals. And just be aware that when you're under stress, or when the person you're dealing with is under stress, so they're going to go to their default. So they may be a type A too, and they may go to the type A. So that's so yeah. So we'll get you that assessment, and you take it, and you can have some fun with it and think about it. Yeah, take it at home. When you're with your family, see what you come out with, and see what you come out with it when you're in your workplace. So we talked about the first element of conflict was communication, and then the second one is power. So, and I think this is going to be pretty obvious, but what is the type of power that exists in a landlord-tenant relationship?
I would argue the power of time, because without a doubt, the last 2 years, the tenants have had the upper hand. But the power of time, and that's where, for those of you who are on, I volunteered while we're getting up and going. I use a process I named as future pacing, where I tell them, like, hey, I'm not going to fight you. I understand you're going to fight this all the way. You're going to have some wins, but think you're going to be living here forever, or do you think there's going to be a day when this comes to an end? So if you do, could we talk about what a better way to control how you decide to leave is? And that's really helped, because I never fight them. So I'd say the power of time. That's, again, if you're in a landlord who can afford to let it burn a little bit, for lack of a better phrase.
Good. Okay, so yeah, so that's definitely one element, and some of the other elements is first of all, the delegated positional power. So as a landlord, you are in pretty much your delegated power, because you are the one, it's your property, and you're allowing someone to come in your property, and you're initiating a business transaction with this person. You're the one who has the business. So you are in positional power, delegated power. It's the same thing at work. If you're the boss, or if you're not the boss, you know that there's a delegated positional power. Then there's relational power. This may be your business partner is a relative. It could be a relative, or your business partner is somebody that's the relative of somebody very important to you. And so the fact that, by virtue of the relationship that you have with this person, gives them power. This is my, remind me why I hired you. Oh yeah, you're the boss's son. That's relational power. Okay. Then the last time is expertise power. So this is the person that knows how to turn on the electric grid. So this person has a lot of power, because, no pun intended, because they know the recipe. They know they have the switch. They know they have the key. So that's another type of power, expertise power. So this is somebody in the company that may not be the boss, but because they have access to the tools or they know the secret recipe, they have the expertise. So we think about in this business what we have, and it may shift. I think what Brian's saying is as excellent. Is sometimes the tenant has more power than you do, and sometimes you have more power than the tenant has. And of course, the courts look at it. I think generally they look at the landlord as having the most power, and the laws are written probably that way, in my opinion, leaning that way. But you also have, it can flip flop. So realize that there is power. There's a power element in all conflict. So I want to skip ahead pretty quickly.
And just
How to manage.
while you're doing that, one of the reasons why the court tends to think that the landlord is in the position of power is because most of the time the landlord is represented by an attorney. So they have a professional that's helping them navigate through the system and through the process, who is familiar with how things work in the court, whereas a substantial majority of tenants represent themselves. So when you have an unrepresented landlord and unrepresented tenant, you see a little less of the court treating that as a power imbalance because you have two unrepresented parties. So a lot of it has to do with who's represented and who's not in that relationship.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. So how to manage power is, interdependence is really important. The fact that we know we need each other. Stress how we can meet each other's needs, and a calm persistence. I think that's what Brian talked about. It's like, yeah, time is going to be up. The clock is up. You have to pay or you have to go or whatever, and letting the people know that this is kind of how, ultimately what's probably going to happen. And in mediation, that's kind of when we have the facts of life talk. We stop in mediation, and then I bring the parties in and I say, okay, if this mediation doesn't succeed, what are your options? And it's like, well, I'm going to take them to court. I say, okay, well, let's follow that training. Okay, what exactly does that mean? How much is that going to cost you? How much time is it going to take you? So that's a way to manage power, is by explaining and understanding what can ultimately happen. And even though you have power, you may not want to leverage it. Letting the other person know how they will gain by helping you is really what it's all about. Okay, so deciding if you're going to have the conversation. I do a whole piece about deciding whether or not you're going to have the conversation. I show what's my purpose for having it, decide if this is the best way to address the issue, and then kind of decide, am I content with the status quo? And then if I'm not, then I need to have the conversation. I show a police clip because I like those. So this is the difficult conversation guide. So this is what I hope you'll take away with you. So it's new thinking. It's new solving a problem in a new way. So first of all, we want to prepare for the conversation. You actually have the ability, I think, to prepare for the conversation. So what's my story? So this is where you're actually laying out what are the facts, what are the circumstances of the situation. What's the other person's story? So they're not just going to tell you, I lost my job and I couldn't pay the rent. There's a story there. And then the third story is kind of the difference. What's kind of in the middle? It's not exactly splitting it, but it's kind of like what would a neutral person, like a mediator, what would they say, or what would come out after talking to a mediator? So we want to prepare our story. So my version of events. So, I may, pull out the lease and say, okay, this is my version of events. They signed the lease. Everything was good. This was our relationship. We got along fine. I was dealing mostly with the husband. Then all of a sudden the wife became the primary person that I dealt with, and then things just kind of went south. So that's my version of events, is if we're talking about communication or lack thereof of something that happened. So I'm sharing it from my own viewpoint. This is exactly how I see it. So you're actually writing down some of these bullet points as you're preparing the conversation. You're thinking, okay, what were my intentions and impacts? So my intentions were not to make the person mad, but the result may have been that I made them mad. So my intentions were to spell out objectively the points of the lease, or my intentions were, I need to go inside the apartment, purely for safety, to check something. And, the impact is they think I'm snooping, or they think I'm weird or something, or, so my intentions and my impact. So look at that. Look at what were my intentions and then probably what was my impact. And then what are my assumptions? Do I assume that these people have rented from people before? Maybe they have, maybe they haven't. Do I assume that they have not taken care of property because of something that I think about them? So think about what are my assumptions and if that's how that's playing in. Then think about, did I contribute anything? And this is where we talk about blame. I try to stay away from blame because it doesn't really accomplish anything. Blame denotes punishment. Somebody doing something wrong needs to be punishment. So I talk about contribution. So what did I contribute to the problem? Could it have been I actually didn't read the contract with them, the lease with them. We did it hurried at night. They were moving in. They said, yeah, whatever, let me sign. So the fact that I didn't explain that to them, they didn't understand it. Did I contribute that? Is there blame? And like I said, if there is blame, we're gonna cinch that back, talk more about contribution. Then there's the feeling conversation in my story. So even though this is a business transaction, there are feelings and emotions that come into this. Unexpressed feelings leak into the conversation. So I'm renting out my, my mother's apartment, or my mother's house or her condo after she died, and I just can't believe that they would, destroy the property. My mother would roll over in her grave. So we have these feelings that are leaking into the conversation that are unexpressed. So think about that. Are we taking this personally? We become overly emotionally involved. I'll recognize that my feelings are not the truth. These feelings are supposed to like color our world, right? But they're not necessarily the truth. Feelings should follow, and feelings may be positive or negative, but let's try to, especially in a business relationship, try to sort them out so that we can see what the truth of the situation is. And then this is kind of a favorite topic of mine. It's inward versus outward mindset. And at the end, I have some books. But this is kind of like, do we see our tenants as people that are should be just happy they have a place to a roof over their head, or do we see them as individuals who have hopes and dreams and are just as important as we are? It's like, you might have heard the phrase, I may not be much, but I'm all I think about. Yeah, so is that the way we kind of approach life? And it's good to ask ourselves, do we have an inward or an outward mindset? Because if we have an inward mindset and everybody's here to serve us, we're probably not going to deal with conflict very well. And we all have times when we know we should do something, we don't do it for other people. So keep that in mind. And then getting even deeper, this even goes into our identity. Say, am I myself a competent person? Am I a good person? Am I worthy of love? I mean, if we don't feel all those things about ourselves, it's going to reflect into our work, into our relationships with other people in this business relationship. And it's not all or nothing. I mean, we sometimes we say, oh yeah, I'm just a terrible person, and then we just everything, our whole world revolves around that. But that's obviously not the case. So then we go through what's the other person's story. So now we just think about, okay, what's their version of events? So what are they really going to say when they say why the wife is now talking to me and she's got a totally different story? It's like, what happened here? So you think about what their version of events is, and then what were their intentions and what was their impact? So they intended something different, but the impact was, we now all of a sudden we're at an impasse, and that wasn't probably their intention, but that was the impact. The same thing. What were their assumptions? Did they assume that you were going to just forgive them a debt, or based on circumstances in their life, or what? So think about that. And then what did the other person contribute to this problem? So what was kind of the thing that they're probably going to say, or would they agree that they contributed to the problem? So you're essentially writing, 2 or 3 columns, one column for your story, one column for their story. And as you're writing down the facts, you're figuring, and then of course, what about their identity? What are they going to say? Do they feel, have they lost their job? Is their identity like in the toilet right now because they just feel like they can't provide for their family or whatever? Think about that. And then and then of course they have the same feelings and and can figure out if they're talking from a place of truth or emotions. So then the third story would be the third column. So this is describing the problem as the difference between two stories. So it might be, the problem may be the fact that, rent isn't being paid. So that's like the problem. So nobody will disagree that rent's not being paid, but of course the reasons why it's not being paid is important. It includes the things in the conflict that you can agree on. So I can agree that you deserve to be paid rent, and this is what, but how it's paid, when it's paid, those may be all things. Why it's not being paid, those are things that we can't yet agree on. Okay, so the third story is kind of coming up with these things. Okay, what's a mediator going to say once the facts kind of come out? So then it's having the conversation. So it's as simple as I would like to talk to you about the incident last week if the police were called to the property and it was a big melee. So you would just say, don't say I want to talk to you about when the police came and I was woken up from my sleep and you know and I'm really mad about this. No, try to just name what we're going to talk about without getting into the emotions. So it's as easy as that, or I'd like to revisit the lease, or I'd like to talk to you about rent payment without saying instead of saying I'd like to talk to you about all the rent that you owe, the back rents that you owe. Try to have it come out as neutral and as positive. And then just ask them to go first. So if you're talking about the party, chances are good if you let them, they will tell you the whole story about the party and exactly what happened. And you let them talk first. And then that way, you may learn something. It may soften you a little bit. It may have you second guess what you were going to say and say things a little bit differently. But at least it gives the other person the chance to go first, especially in this power, we've talked about the power element here.
Let me throw
And then
out.
when you share from your point of view, use I statements instead of you did this, you did that. Say okay, well when I got home and I saw the police here, I was concerned, and I wanted to make sure everything was all right and that this doesn't happen again. And so you're sharing from your point of view using I statements instead of finger pointing and you. And then start to problem solve together. Say, well, that's wow, must have been scary to have the police come. Let's talk about how that cannot happen again. Let's talk about communication. Let's talk about whatever the case is. Let's talk about how to do this better next time in the future. So it's really important, like I said, to listen to them. We think it's cut and dry. It's pay the rent, don't pay the rent. Let me come in, let me not come in. But listening is really important. So problem solving involves inventing options that meet both sides' concerns and interests. Like interest is really important, and the concerns. Looking the standards and judgments for what should happen. And in our case, the lease really is our guide. I mean, it's like, what? I hate the situation that you're in too. Let's go back to the lease. I think Angela mentioned that. I mean, that's really in this relationship, the lease is your savior, hopefully. So hopefully it's a good lease, and just say, okay, this is the way that I interpret the lease, and then so that should reduce a lot, or whatever rules you have, and they've signed off on them. You look back to those. Say, well, let's go back to the lease and let's see if that can guide us so that we can move forward here. And you're using those. You're couching the whole conversation in words that are professional. They take the emotion out of it, and they're not casting any blame. So it enhances accountability. It uncovers root causes. I mean, there may be some faults in the lease that you both discover together, and you may say, yeah, this actually isn't really a reasonable thing that I'm asking, and I'm gonna change that. We'll do an addendum or whatever the case is. So root causes, what should happen. It reduces judgment and blame. and talk about how to keep communication open in the future. So the future, the past, change the past. So we're just talking about going forward here. How are things going to change? Maybe that you say, okay, from now on, I would like to communicate just with one of you, or from now on, my wife is going to take over. That's my idea. So just decide who's going to be the person, or how you're going to communicate. From now on, let's do it through email, or let's do it through text, or let's 30 days from now, let's revisit this whole thing. You can do that and just have it be laid out that way. So that's what I'm talking about when we're talking about problem solving. And a great way to do some problem solving is to take advantage of the Vermont Landlord-Tenant Association free mediation right now. That's great. And we were actually talking a little bit before is that program we should be able to figure out a way to extend it to tenants. I recently did a tenant, two tenants in mediation, and it came through a community justice center who paid for the mediation. But I'm thinking that there's probably ways that we can use a grant like this. So if you have tenants that are at each other, mediation is a great tool for that. And then you can, then you aren't necessarily you don't become the bad guy if you offer that type of
Well,
service that doesn't cost you.
Brian, in that situation, I think worst case, we would get the landlord to apply as well for the program and be involved with both of the tenants, because there may be, things that are being discussed that would impact, maybe there's lease changes that need to be made, or, something along those lines. So unless it's just purely something that the landlord wouldn't have any involvement in, I think there's probably always a reason why the landlord should also participate in some of those.
Right.
So
Yeah, I also think that property managers should be aware of all this too. I think sometimes the property manager inadvertently is the problem, and because they don't realize what options they have available to them. And I know getting people to do that job is probably pretty difficult, and it's probably a thankless job, I would imagine.
well, and it's a tough spot to be in, right? Because you're interacting with the tenants, but you also have responsibilities and are interacting with the landlord, and many times you're stuck in the middle, and so you have different people barking at you to some extent to do things. So that can be a very tough position.
Right.
I think it goes back to we're all very entrepreneurial with our natural level of communication. I think an attorney, Tom Heilman, Angela, you're probably familiar with that name, said something to the effect that for better or for worse in our society, we live and die on our words. And if you think about that, even if you're banging a nail, you got to talk to your boss, you got to talk to the client. So the other thing is, Brian, I love it. I respect the time, so I'll shut up in a second. I really love the content, and a couple of the things that that popped up to me, and not only understanding yourself, but how do you approach those opening conversations? So, whenever possible, I strongly encourage people to use open-ended questions. Hey, Angela, I talked to the tenant and, the next year, and they were telling me you had some issues the other night. Well, tell me about that. As opposed to saying, they said your dog did this, 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 and this, because then it allows them to answer more freely as opposed to defending the one perspective of accusation. The other thing is I encourage everybody to remember one of my favorite lines from Chris Voss, something to the effect of average negotiators make assumptions and then they operate on, whereas great negotiators have multiple hypotheses and they go into negotiations looking to find the black swans that exist. That black swan is that something that's really important or something that's happening in their life that's making them do what they're doing right now, so that we're as Suzanne Scott would say, we're not water skiing on the topic, we're diving, scuba diving.
Excellent. Yep. Yeah, and that's the famous mediation is the iceberg, that the issue isn't happening above the surface, it's happening below. So so we're almost done. Here's some free tips. You can't change other people. Don't exaggerate. You always do this. You never do this. So you appreciate it when your spouse does that. You always do. You never do that. You appreciate that. Well, we don't either. Use the word and instead of but. So you say, I'd like to talk to you about the rent and upkeep of the property. Or instead of saying, but you did this, but and is a great word to use. And then think about what I'm failing or doing that's contributing to the dynamic. So what is it? These are open questions if we have time, and these are some resources that you may want to contribute to some of the things I've talked about. Difficult conversations goes into really a lot of detail about the 3 conversations. And then skipping down to the bottom, leadership and self-deception by the Arbinger Institute. That talks a lot about this inward-outward mindset. So those are the 2 that I highly recommend, and the others are good as well.
Anybody in our audience have anything to add into the Q&A? Because I think this is phenomenal resources, and candidly, not just for tenant landlord, but I know there's a lot of real estate agents on here. And this to me is gold. And very candidly, I've got a couple challenges that are happening today that's nothing to do with a tenant. And this was exactly what I needed. So thank you.
While we're waiting to see if anybody has any questions that are going to pop in there to the Q&A, I just want to let people know about our couple of upcoming seminars. So we're sticking to this second Tuesday of the month at this time frame. So December 9th, we're going to be talking about all things legislative. We are going to have the association lobbyist is going to be joining us to talk about how bills are developed and how they move through the legislature, how to effectively communicate with legislators. So there is, ways that you can help convince people that your position is right. And then some brief chats about legislation that we see currently before things to keep an eye on for this next session. Then January 13th, we're going to be talking all things property management from Brian's perspective. So that'll be fun.
Excellent. Yeah, we just got another minute or so because we know we started late. We didn't know if you have any questions. Brian, I can't stress enough. I've really enjoyed today's seminar. I'd in fact like to, here's a great question, Coltall panelists. What was Brian's most challenging negotiation and how did he resolve? And Cole, I'm assuming you don't mean me.
Well, I can think of the tenant one was very challenging because the one tenant, I'm sure, was dealing with mental illness, and so that was just like she was literally hearing noise that really probably wasn't there. But what happened is during the mediation, we learned that oddly, like tragically lost children in an accident. Different circumstances, so they had that one thing together, and that really, it really didn't become about the incident, the issue of the noise. It became that they're human beings and they actually had something in common, even though they're like totally opposite of the socioeconomic everything. So that was once we learned that, so that was challenging until and that's why we just ask questions, we just let people talk, because stuff like that comes out, and then once they humanize each other, that's a huge piece of finding that one thing that they can agree on, and then everything else kind of works itself out. So as far as hostage negotiating, I could definitely think of a suicidal person. Those are difficult, very difficult, because they really, you try to find the one thing they have to live for, and that can be challenging. And if they're drunk and, mental illness and everything, then it's tough too. But
any other comments from our guests? And we really appreciate everybody. We had a little bit of Evite or Eventbrite challenges today. What would be a day in the 2000s without some challenges? But Brian, tremendous thanks. Really appreciate it. It's actually one of my favorite topics is just mediation, conflict resolution, negotiation. I love it, especially when you can get to a point where either a win-win or everybody's like, yeah, it wasn't a phenomenal outcome, but it was equitable. Let's see, how do you manage your emotions after challenging negotiations? That's probably one of the hardest ones.
Yeah, that's hard. You have to be able to check them at the door, be able to blow off some steam. Have breaks. you know, I mean, being able to humanize the other person and see their perspective, even if you don't agree with it, is really important. Um, but yeah, I mean, your emotions get to you sometimes, and you just have to stop and do another day, or yeah, not easy.
No, it isn't. What's the old joke? I discovered the enemy. It is us. So Brian, I can't stress enough. Really, really appreciate your time. Angela, thank you for all that you're doing upon all the property owners and the landlords. Most of you guys know this, but I'm Brian Armstrong with Cato Vermont, Strongwell Real Estate Team and Strongwell Property Management. If you guys have any questions, this is available for recording, I believe, Angela, or will be in a couple of days. And I encourage you to check out Brian, reach out to him. I'd love to follow up about a possible continuing education class for real estate agents. But I encourage you guys, follow up with him, see if he can help you out. And probably because we have realtors on here, we could probably use him actually in some of our transactions. And I may have a opportunity for you, Brian, that we should talk about in a couple of days.
And if you are a landlord and tenant and having some conflict, please come check out the Landlords Association mediation program, because that also could be of great benefit. And as mentioned, Brian Miller is one of our mediators in that program. And it's gotten easier for people to qualify. So if you've looked at it before, it's much simpler now.
Excellent.
So
thank you, everyone. Brandon Cole, thank you for your help running this thing. Everybody have a great day. We appreciate you.
Thank you.